I want to once again thank our hosts, BioIT World Conference and Expo, and Cambridge Health Tech, as well as Biomed Central, open access publishers of journals such as BMC Bioinformatics. This is the 10th annual awarding of the Benjamin Franklin Award for Open Access in the Life Sciences, and appropriately, the 30,000 members of bioinformatics.org have chosen the brother of the first laureate as the recipient. In the words of his nominators, this year's laureate uses his high visibility in social media to advocate for open access by sharing links to discussions, mentioning open access articles and initiatives, and pushing for the opening up of popular closed access articles. This culture is shared with the students who advocate for open access peer reviewing and created a peer-to-peer service for sharing bioinformatics materials, articles, software, and data sets. He's the academic editor-in-chief of PLOS Biology and voices his opinions and support for open access publication and open data sharing on his Tree of Life blog. In addition to just voicing his opinion, he also practices what he preaches by refusing to publish in non-open access journals. With respect to bioinformatics, he has been involved with many software packages that are freely available, such as the recent Amphora and PhyloOTU. Lastly, he helped release a new open data sharing tool for scientists called BioTorrents. This is just another step in encouraging all scientists to share their data and results more openly. It is with great pleasure that we award the 10th annual Benjamin Franklin Award to Professor Jonathan A. Eisen of the University of California, Davis.
You thought me coming up here may have been like some assistant or something like that when I was, but no, alas. So if you haven't seen, this is my PLOS 1 Red Sox shirt, which you'll hear about in a second. So I think I'm really excited to get this award, in part in Boston, where I was born, and didn't grow up for a long time and moved away when I was little, but I always liked coming back to Boston, and that my brother was the first recipient, which I'll tell you about in a second. And I'm just going to do a very brief storytelling about my involvement in open science and relate it to Boston and Ben Franklin. So I assume many people know that Ben Franklin was actually born in Boston, so it's nice that we're getting this award here. They have his house somewhere around the corner from here. I don't know exactly where it is. I went to it when I was little, but I don't remember exactly. And obviously many people know that Ben Franklin was really into freedom, but also he was really into science and sharing scientific information, and the relationship between science and freedom is really important in the open science movement, in this push to make everything associated with scientific discovery more open. And it's not really that hard to push this, because as you hear at this meeting and you've already heard here, science is about openness. It's about sharing of ideas, about sharing of information. Scientists in general are open. And what we've done, unfortunately, is create a bunch of social structures that limit the openness, in part, in science that serve as barriers. And one of those has been forms of scientific publishing, which I'll just briefly mention in a minute. I just thought I would talk about my involvement in bioinformatics. So I actually started learning bioinformatics here, well, in Cambridge, not in Boston, but it's close enough. And the first thing I learned was to use this program called GDE, the Genetic Data Environment, which was written by this guy, Steve Smith, who eventually went on to GCG and adapt the GCG software. And it was this really great, freely available GUI-based system for incorporating all of your own bioinformatics tools into one package. And we used this to make sequence alignments and to do evolutionary analysis. And this was my introduction to sort of free, openly available software. You could just download the software. I was kind of surprised by this and install it. It was freely available, and you could modify the Windows system, and people shared their own modifications. This was about 20 years ago, and this was my introduction to getting involved in bioinformatics and my sort of slow introduction to this community of scientists who are really into sharing and openness, which is definitely true in a lot of science, but probably a little bit more true in bioinformatics than in many other fields. So even though my brother isn't here, I thought I would try to embarrass him. So my brother, who was the first recipient of the Ben Franklin Award, was actually born in Boston also. He's the older one here. That's my brother. It's actually his birthday today. So happy birthday to my brother, Michael Eisen. And if you don't know, the reason I'm telling you a little bit about my brother is my brother was one of the co-founders of the Public Library of Science with Pat Brown and Harold Varmus. And there's a lot of history behind the Public Library of Science, but if you don't know, it basically started as a petition, sort of, nailing things on the wall to try and encourage openness and freedom. And they circulated this petition to try and get scientists to say that they would agree to publish, they would only publish in open access journals, and they would only review for open access journals. That is, journals that there were no restrictions in the accessibility of the scientific literature. They were both freely and openly available. And being free is one thing, that is, you don't have to pay for it. Being open is another, that is, anybody can do anything they want with the material, which is what PLOS now publishes under this broad Creative Commons license, and Biomed Central also publishes under a broad Creative Commons license. Don't get confused by the people that call something open access when what they mean is just that you can freely access it on the web. It's a little bit different if it's just cheap and not completely openly available. So anyway, they circulated this petition. They sent it to me. I was working at Tiger, the Institute for Genomic Research at the time. And this is great. So my brother is working to circulate this petition, and he sends it to me, and he says, "Can you try and get Craig Venter to sign this petition?" He didn't ask if I could sign the petition. So I did sign the petition. I don't think Craig did initially, but Claire Fraser, actually, the head of Tiger, did. And I signed the petition, as did about 100,000 other scientists saying they were going to do this. And it had very little effect. So one of the reasons it didn't have a big effect was that a lot of scientists felt that there weren't enough, let's just choose a nice word for it, snooty open access journals out there that they could publish in and feel like it could massage their egos in a better way than some of the other currently available open access publications. And so the Public Library of Science went from being a petition to being a publisher. And they launched two journals in particular in about 2003 and 2004, one called PLOS Biology, to be the snooty biology publication, and PLOS Medicine, to be the snooty medicine publication. They recruited editors from New England Journal of Medicine and The Lancet and Nature and Science and Cell, and launched these sort of hard-to-get-into open access journals. And then eventually they launched a whole series of other journals, including PLOS One, which I actually love. That's one of the new Public Library of Science journals. So when this started, I got involved in PLOS Biology as an academic editor. And I thought that this was sort of an interesting thing, but I really didn't. I did it sort of for family affiliation. My brother asked me if I wanted to be involved, and it was hard to say no. But I wasn't completely convinced as to the benefits of openness and open science and just in general. It was more just I wanted my brother to shut up. And so I started to get involved, and we submitted some of our, I was working at Tiger. We were getting papers recruited to Nature and Science all the time, and I submitted some of my papers to PLOS Biology. But again, I still wasn't completely convinced until I had an interaction with another Ben Franklin winner, Sean Eddy, who among many of the things that he's done is to help develop PFAM database and hidden Markov model software. And I was at the Fort Lauderdale meeting to discuss genomic data release policies. This is the follow-up to the Bermuda Accord agreement meeting. And there was this big discussion about what the Genome Center should do with genomic sequence data, and should they be releasing the data with no restrictions on the use of the data. And there was a big discussion about whether or not that had been done with the Human Genome Project and how we should promote openness and genome data availability. And there was this argument going on. And Sean basically got up and gave a talk at this meeting that said, this whole thing is ludicrous. The whole reason we get funding to sequence genomes of organisms is to provide the data to the community. And that he basically went through many examples of his own software as well as data where there were benefits to everyone for openness. And this resonated with me. I went back to Tiger and started releasing our data for my projects with no restrictions. So the difference is that at the time, many people would sequence a genome, release the data, and then say, you can do a blast search to find your gene of interest, but you can't do a genome-level analysis of this data until we're done. And I changed this for my projects. I just said, here's the data. Everybody can have access to it with no restrictions. And Sean had helped convince me of this, but I still was not a complete convert to this open science, open access movement. And then we had a family medical emergency. To make a long story short, my wife was pregnant with our first baby. There was a botched amniocentesis. My wife was in the hospital for about a month and a half after this, and the medical professionals that she was under the care of initially had no idea what they were doing. And I needed to look up some information in the literature while this was going on, for example, about RhoGAM immunization, which they forgot to do during the course of this. And I logged on at like 2 in the morning from my wife's hospital room trying to figure out whether or not you could give a RhoGAM immunization after 7 days instead of after 3 days, trying to get the literature, and I couldn't get access to it. Here I was, a trained scientist willing to look at the literature and try and figure out what to do, and Tiger was a small nonprofit institution. We didn't have subscriptions to anything, and I couldn't read the literature that my tax money and other people's tax money had paid for, and here I was possibly being able to help the medical care and not being able to access it. And that was it. I completely changed after that moment to being an open science advocate. It was ludicrous that I could not have access to that information when it was, I had to pay $30 for each article without knowing whether or not they were relevant. And it was ridiculous. So not that I could have, changed the course of what was going on with our baby, which eventually we lost, and not that we necessarily knew exactly what was going on with the RhoGAM immunization, but nevertheless, it just pissed me off so much that I couldn't have access to this, that was the moment that I saw the light, I guess, that my brother had been kicking me in the side of the head for 4 years about, and I didn't understand until this personal experience. So now I'm the open access arch evangelist, I guess you could say. Even though my brother was one of the founders of the Public Library of Science, this is my license plate. I desperately was filling out the forms when I thought he was going to try and get it. Little competition is good. So anyway, I am now very heavily involved in a lot of things associated with open science, and that includes not just open access publishing, which I think is very important, and again, to distinguish between just stuff being freely available and openly available. As you heard in the last talk, there's all sorts of interesting things you can do with the scientific literature if you can package the full text of the literature and do integrated, complex language processing searches, et cetera, of that literature. If you can't then make that available to others, it limits its power and its usage. And that's what openness is about, as opposed to just being able to download stuff for free. You can do an analysis of the literature and make a complex sort of database available to everybody in the community. And I think that sort of openness is really important, not just obviously in the literature, but in software, in data, in every aspect of science. And I think that's what I've been trying to push now, is to try and move to a point where scientists who want to share basically everything have a way of being able to do that without costing themselves something, without costing them the ability to get hired, without costing them sort of the priority in discovering things. So the more we can develop systems that help people share but also get recognized for what they discovered and what they shared, we're going to be better off. And so that's what I've been doing recently, and I thank you very much for the recognition. And I went to the Red Sox game last night. They didn't win, but I'm still happy to have come here to Boston. So thanks.